Have you had an encounter you'd like to share on this channel? Well, if so, send me an email with all the details. You can send your email to contact@buckeyebigfoot.com. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back. Now, we have an incredible autumn evening here in Southwest Ohio, and, well, you know, that's just right for a ride down into Sasquatch Valley. So grab your snackage, get on up in the saddle, and let's get moving. Those Sasquatches are waiting on us, and you know, it's not wise to keep them waiting too long. Let's go. Hello, Nance. Shortly after I sent you my last stories, my health took a nosedive. I've had a series of strokes. One was bad, and two not so bad, but there's no such thing as a good stroke. After one of my last strokes, I had to do a few days of in-house physical therapy. While I was doing my physical therapy, I met a friendly older gentleman who told me that he was trying to break in a new hip before they sent him back home. He never told me his name, only that he was raised in rural Arkansas and his family raised beef and cotton. As we were taking a break from our physical therapy and waiting on lunch, the TV was on, and the show The Unexplained was playing on the TV. This episode was about monsters. After the segment talking about Bigfoot was over, he told me the story of the Bigfoot that lived in the area he was raised in. When he was a young man, he would hear stories about the men working in the fields. They would often see footprints in the freshly plowed soil, and from time to time, someone would see an ape walking in the timberline. But no one paid it much mind, because it didn't cause any trouble. He said that a couple of young men tried to catch it, but it would take off in the woods at a fast run. The grown men in the area told the young men that they were just wasting their time and to just let whatever it was be. It wasn't hurting anything. If it did start to cause any trouble, the men would take care of it. Every once in a while it would cross the road and someone would see it, but no attempt to catch it was ever made besides the few times the young men tried. I asked him if he had ever seen it. He said a few times, once when he was going to town with his mom, and once when he was helping in the hayfield. But the one time he got a good look at it was when he was attending a church singing, and he had to make a trip to the privy. On his way from the privy, he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. He looked, and there it was, standing beside an oak tree, listening to the church singing. He stood there for a few minutes, watching the creature before he walked back into the church and joined in the singing. I asked him if it was scary. He said no, not at all, that the critter wasn't as big as the Bigfoot that makes it onto the TV shows. He said that it was just a little over 5 feet tall and not aggressive at all. He then stated that he had heard stories about what it could have been, an ape that escaped from a circus, to a hermit that lived alone, or that it could have been an escapee from an asylum. What he saw up close was not human, but looked so human that he said that he's glad that no one tried to catch it. He said something like that needs to live free. He told his parents about what he saw after they got home. His dad told him that he was lucky to have seen such a thing. He then said that the sightings went on for a few more years, and then the sightings stopped. He said that either the creature had moved on or it had passed away. I asked him if he had seen anything else like that critter. He said no, but he didn't spend any time looking for one either. The next day I was discharged from the hospital, and I returned home. I know that this story isn't flashy or showy, but I honestly believe that the gentleman was telling me the truth. Signed, Chris. Well, howdy there. My name is Becky, and I'm a lady who's in her mid-50s. My story takes place back in the early 1980s, when I was just a young girl growing up in Story County, Iowa, not all that far from Des Moines. Now, back in those days, my parents prioritized their respective careers and work above anything else. They felt that even though I was in my early teenage years, that I still needed watchful eyes on me to make sure I didn't end up getting into any mischief. So, after school, my Aunt Connie would pick me up and drop me off at my grandparents' farm. Aunt Connie was and is married to my Uncle Lloyd, who is the younger brother of my dad. She didn't work, so she was also the person who almost always drove me back to my house when my parents got home late from their jobs. Grandma and Grandpa had a lot of farm animals for many years, but in the late 70s and early 80s, they sold their horses, the remaining cattle they had, and the pigs that they'd kept in the pens. Although they sold almost all of the livestock they had, they kept their chickens in a large wooden and wire coop that was situated and built onto the side of a wooden tool shed. It was dilapidated even in the 80s, but the attached coop was in much better condition. Grandma or Grandpa would usually be the ones to grab a basket and collect the eggs, but sometimes they'd not, since they knew it was a thing that I enjoyed doing. To me, it felt good to think that as a kid, I was contributing in some fashion and helping my grandparents out. At the time, I didn't even think about their ages, but they were in their 70s then. They were very spry, though, and hard-working, and they weren't afraid of physical labor, let me tell you. I'd say about 300 feet or so behind the house is where the big barn was. At one time, it was where the horses were being kept, although there were 2 stalls for the horses and a large fenced-in portion deeper inside for the cows. In the very back and off to one side, there was an enclosed pig pen and trough, along with large, heavy metal buckets which would be filled with water. It stunk to high heaven with all the pig poop when they were in there, but by the early 80s, well, that was all a memory. In the big open loft of the barn, you could get to the top by using a wooden ladder in the building. Now, when he sold the livestock, however, he never did get rid of the several bales of straw up top. I don't know if it didn't occur to him to get rid of the bales or if he didn't care or need the money. Uncle Lloyd was well-to-do, and I found out later on that he and Aunt Connie were helping to support Grandma and Grandpa financially. Now, what happened next was after all of the animals had been sold off, aside from those chickens I mentioned. One day after school and after Aunt Connie dropped me off at their house, they said that they wanted to speak to me. I wondered if I had done something wrong, and I voiced that to them. I was quickly assured that no, I hadn't done anything wrong, but that they wanted to tell me something. "Okay," I said. "What do you want to tell me?" Well, Grandma was smiling the whole time, but it was Grandpa who did the talking. He said, "Becky, you might see them one day, so I want to tell you now so as not to alarm you." I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I wondered, what could be so important for him to say that? Grandpa then told me that for the past 2 weeks or so, a large hairy man and a large hairy woman had been staying in the barn. I asked him, "What do you mean, Grandpa?" He said that early one morning he was outside checking on the chickens in the coop. He went on and said that he saw the barn door was open, so he went to investigate, and when he reached the barn entrance, he saw a very tall, hairy man standing there, and a hairy woman who wasn't quite as tall, but she was standing next to him. I remember the first thing I said to him after that was asking if he was scared. He said, well, yes, he was a little scared, but that these tall, hairy people didn't seem to mean him any harm. He said he could see the intelligence in their eyes and felt that if he spoke to them, they would understand him. I asked him how he knew this, and he said he wasn't sure. It was just a very strong feeling in his gut. I asked him, "Well, what happened after that?" He said, "Well, I told them they could stay in the barn, but that I had 3 rules. Rule number 1, don't come close to my family. I don't want them to be scared. Rule number 2, don't eat my chickens. And rule number 3, don't damage my property." He then said that he added, "And if you're inside the barn, close the door behind you." Now, like the young, curious girl I was then, and still am to this day, I asked, "Well, what happened after that?" Grandpa told me that the male exhaled softly, and the female then did the same thing as her mate. He said he took it as their understanding and agreeing to the conditions that he set forth. Then I said, "Well, I want to see them. When can I see them, Grandpa?" Grandpa said that from now on I was only allowed to go as far as the chicken coop, even though the coop and shed was a lot closer to the farmhouse than it was to the barn. He continued with, "From what I've seen of these hairy folks, they almost always leave out early in the wee hours, go to the woods all day, and then come back under the cover of night." The woods were not really far from the barn, and I'd say a good 40 or 50 feet behind the barn itself. Grandpa added, "We'll work out a time for you to see them from the kitchen window with the binoculars." I agreed to this immediately, excitedly nodding my head up and down. Then Grandpa said, "And another thing. Don't say a word of this to your parents, your Uncle Lloyd, Aunt Connie, or the kids at your school, or anybody else for that matter, okay?" Again, I agreed. I was never a snitch and wouldn't think of betraying the trust that Grandma and Grandpa placed in me. I'll tell you, though, it was hard keeping my mouth shut with what I knew. Still, I never spilled the beans, and I didn't tell a soul. Well, it wasn't long after that when my grandparents said to tell Mom and Dad that I wanted to spend Friday night at their house. Mom and Dad, of course, agreed. I had spent more than a few nights at Grandma and Grandpa's house, so this wasn't out of the ordinary. I slept in one of the spare bedrooms, and remember Grandma waking me up early Saturday morning, telling me to quickly dress and come to the kitchen. When I made my way to the kitchen not long after dressing, I saw that Grandpa was already waiting there. He had the binoculars ready and had me looking out the large window, focusing my attention on the barn doors. Sunrise had only just happened a handful of minutes before. My grandparents had the timing down pat. I kept watching for another minute or maybe 2. Honestly, it felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the barn doors opened up slowly, and I saw 2 huge, hairy people walk out. First, the male, then the female right behind. I remember their fur being a dirty brown and hanging off their bodies. The male was a few inches taller than the female, and while shorter than he was, she was not short. She had big breasts also, and between those and the height difference, well, that was the only way I could tell them apart. As quickly as they appeared, they moved around the side of the barn and were out of sight. It was really fluid, very quick how they moved, almost like ghosts. In my mind, they were a lot like Chewbacca, but even the female was much taller and wider than he is portrayed on screen. Like Grandpa, I wasn't scared, though that might have not been the case if I had seen them up close and personal, like my grandpa did. Both my grandparents asked me what I thought, and I think I said something like, "Oh, that was cool." You know, a standard answer that a lot of kids give when they're asked about something that they believe to be awesome. Well, that was the one and only time I saw them. According to Grandpa, they stayed just a couple of more months, and then they left and never returned. Grandpa said, though, that once he had heard a few coyotes loudly barking not far from the house and the chicken coop. Then there was a deafening roar that was unleashed, promptly shutting the canines up and scattering them. I lost my grandpa in 1987 and Grandma in 1993. I will never forget the special times I spent with them in my youth and seeing those tall, hairy, giant people who I think just needed a temporary place to call home for a bit. Signed, Becky M. Well, thank you to Christopher and Becky for sending those in. I really do appreciate it. Now, Christopher mentioned that he had sent other stories in previously. If you want to hear those stories that he's collected and sent in, I'll put the links to them in the video description below. Otherwise, I want to thank you all for making this journey with me tonight. It wasn't as long as some, but I think it was still a great journey. Now, don't worry, we'll be meeting up again soon. But until then, please always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.